Hello, and welcome to the daily chapter reading of the book Pride and Prejudice and Zombies by Jane Austen and Seth Grahame-Smith, Chapter 11. When the ladies removed after dinner, Elizabeth ran up to her sister and, seeing her well, attended her into the drawing-room, where she was welcomed by Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst with many professions of pleasure. Elizabeth had never seen them so agreeable as they were during the hour which passed before the gentlemen appeared. Despite their lack of fighting skill, she had to admit that their powers of conversation were considerable. If only words were capable of beheading a zombie, she thought, I would presently find myself in the company of the world's greatest warriors. But when the gentlemen entered, Miss Bingley's eyes were instantly turned toward Darcy, and she had something to say to him before she enhanced many steps. He addressed himself to Jane with a polite congrats. Mr. Hurst also made her a slight bow, and said he was very glad indeed that it had been but a cold and not the strange plague. But the greatest warmth remained for Bingley's salutation. He was full of joy and attention. The first half-hour was spent in piling up the fire, lest she should suffer from the change of room. He then sat down by her, and talked scarcely to anyone else. Elizabeth took to the small grinding in the corner of the room, and watched it all with great delight whilst sharpening the gentlemen's swords, which she had found embarrassingly dull upon examination. When tea was over, Mr. Hurst reminded his sister-in-law of the card-table, but in vain. She had obtained private intelligence that Mr. Darcy did not wish for cards, and Mr. Hurst soon found even his open petition rejected. She assured him that no one intended to play, and the silence of the whole party on the subject seemed to justify her. Mr. Hurst had therefore nothing to do but to stretch himself on one of the sofas and go to sleep. Darcy took up a book, Miss Bingley did the same, and Mrs. Hurst, principally occupied in playing with one of Elizabeth's throwing stars, joined now and then in her brother's conversation with Mrs. Bennet. Miss Bingley's attention was quite as much engaged in watching Mr. Darcy's progress through his book as in reading her own, and she was perpetually either making some inquiry or looking at his page. She could not win him, however, to any conversation. He merely answered her question and read on. At length, quite exhausted by the attempt to be amused with her own book, which she had only chosen because it was the second volume of his, she gave a great yawn, and said, "How pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading." "Spoken like one who has never known the ecstasy of holding a still-beating heart in her hand," said Darcy. Miss Bingley, who was quite used to having her lack of combat training impugned, made no reply. She then yawned again, threw aside her book, and cast her eyes round the room in quest for some amusement. When hearing her brother mentioning a ball to Miss Bennet, she turned suddenly towards him and said, "By the by, Charles, are you really serious in meditating a dance at Netherfield? I would advise you to consult the wishes of the present party. I am much mistaken if there are not some among us to whom a ball would be rather a punishment than a pleasure." "If you mean Darcy," cried her brother, "he may go to bed, if he chooses, before it begins. But as for the ball, it is quite a settled thing, and as soon as the ground has sufficiently hardened, and the present increase in unmentionables has passed, I shall send round my cards." "I should like balls infinitely better," she replied, "and if they were carried on in a different manner." "You should like balls infinitely better," said Darcy, "if you knew the first thing about them." Elizabeth blushed and suppressed a smile, slightly shocked by his flirtation with impropriety, and slightly impressed that he should endeavour to flirt with it at all. Miss Bingley, ignorant of his meaning, made no answer, and soon afterwards she got up and walked about the room. Her figure was elegant, and she walked well, but Darcy, at whom it was all aimed, was still inflexibly studious. In the desperation of her feelings, she resolved on one effort more, and, turning to Elizabeth, said, "Miss Eliza Bennet, let me persuade you to follow my example, and take a turn about the room. I assure you it is very refreshing after sitting so long in one attitude." Elizabeth needed no such refreshment. She had once been ordered to maintain a handstand for 6 days in the blistering Beijing sun, but agreed to it immediately. Miss Bingley succeeded no less in the real object of her civility. Mr. Darcy looked up and unconsciously closed his book. He was directly invited to join their party, but he declined it, observing that he could imagine but 2 motives for their choosing to walk up and down the room together, either of which his joining them would upset. What could he mean? She was dying to know what could be his meaning, and asked Elizabeth whether she could at all understand him. "Not at all," was her answer, "but depend upon it, he means to be severe on us, and our surest way of disappointing him will be to ask nothing about it." Miss Bingley, however, was incapable of such self-discipline, and persevered therefore in requiring an explanation of his 2 motives. "I have not the smallest objection to explaining them," said he. "You either choose this method of passing the evening because you are incapable of sitting quietly, or because you are conscious that your figures appear to the greatest advantage in walking. If the first, you are but silly girls undeserving of my attention, and if the second, I can admire you much better from here. In fact, the glow of the fire casts quite a revealing silhouette against the fabric of your gowns." "Oh, shocking!" cried Miss Bingley, stepping away from the fireplace. "I never heard anything so abominable. How shall we punish him for such a speech?" "I have several ideas on the subject," said Elizabeth, "but I'm afraid none would meet with the approval of the present party. Have you no insight into his weaknesses, you and he being so intimately acquainted?" "Upon my honor, I do not. I do assure you that my intimacy has not yet taught me that. Mr. Darcy possesses calmness of manner, presence of mind, and bravery in battle." "Yes, but does he not also possess vanity and pride?" "Yes, vanity is a weakness indeed," said Miss Bingley, "but pride, where there is a real superiority of mind, pride will always be under good regulation." Elizabeth turned away to hide a smile. "Your examination of Mr. Darcy is over, I presume," said Miss Bingley, "and pray what is the result?" "I am perfectly convinced by it that Mr. Darcy has no defect." "No," said Darcy, "I have faults enough, but they are not, I hope, of understanding. My temper I dare not vouch for. I have taken many a life for offences which would seem but trifles to other men." "That is a failing indeed," cried Elizabeth, "but you have chosen your fault well, for it is one which I share. I too live by the warrior code, and would gladly kill if my honor demanded it. You are safe from me. There is, I believe, in every disposition a tendency to some particular evil, a natural defect which not even the best education can overcome. And your defect, Mr. Darcy, is to hate everybody." "And yours," he replied with a smile, "is wilfully to misunderstand them." "Do let us have a little music," cried Miss Bingley, tired of conversation in which she had no share. "Louisa, you will not mind my waking Mr. Hurst?" Her sister had not the smallest objection, and the pianoforte was opened, and Darcy was not sorry for it. He began to feel the danger of paying Elizabeth too much attention.